This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is the Kling L Anderson lecturer, Karen Hickman, who is the director of Oklahoma State University's Environmental Science Program, to discuss Old World Bluestem. Karen explains the history of the grass and how the opinion of it has changed. Karen continues the show and her conversation about Old World Bluestem. We are then joined by Danielle Stock, a PhD student at K-State, as she talks about bull fertility trait estimates. K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent Cassie Thiessen ends today's show saying if gardeners want to grow onions or potatoes, they need to get them planted as soon as possible. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show with the 24th annual Kling L Anderson lecturer at K-State, Karen Hickman, who's the director of Oklahoma State University's Environmental Science Program and was the 2024 president of the Society for Range Management. Karen, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Shelby. I'm happy to be here.
Karen, you're doing a presentation for the Kling L Anderson lecture on Old World Bluestems, and your presentation title is Unraveling the Success of Old World Bluestems, Ecological Mechanisms of an Invasive Grass. And before we dive into more of that, can you remind us, what are Old World Bluestems?
So Old World Bluestems are a group of grasses that were introduced into the United States. It could have been in the early 1900s. And they were introduced from Africa, Eurasia, Greece, China, a wide variety of areas. And we call them Old World because, that's the Old World. Not to be confused with the New World Bluestems, our famous Big Blue and Little Bluestem.
Why did we introduce it?
So these grasses, there's several different types of Old World Bluestems. So different cultivars or varieties. So you can have yellow bluestem or plains bluestem. Those are a Bothria ishamum. That's that lovely scientific name, right? And then you can have Beedall or Caucasian bluestem. And there's also some in Texas called buffalo grass and others. But the ones we're mainly concerned about in this region of the Great Plains are the yellow bluestem and the Caucasian bluestem. And they were introduced because we like to bring things new to our area and test them to see if they're going to help us out in some way. And so these grasses were brought in. There were several different individuals, plant breeders, that across the Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, that brought them in. And they found that they were going to try to figure out if they would be good for forage production. And lo and behold, they did a really good job of breeding them and kind of promoting them as a potential livestock forage, a perennial livestock forage rather than, wheat or oats or ryegrass that's an annual.
Was this then something that was very well liked between Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas?
Well, if we go back in history, Kansas was not a fan of Old World Bluestems. They were brought into Manhattan to K-State, and then the kind of the Plant Materials Center with USDA here in Manhattan. And there were just some people who were pretty skeptical. And I just say, good job. They were skeptical. And then those varieties got shipped down into Oklahoma. So Oklahoma State University and the USDA Ag Research Center service out of Woodward, Oklahoma. Those were the focal places for the plant breeding that resulted in a large promotion of the grasses to be planted in those regions.
Was there some promotion then for conservation programs wanting people to use Old World Bluestem?
So the biggest promotion happened in the mid-'80s when USDA NRCS had the Conservation Reserve Program. So the Conservation Reserve Program took out of production highly or marginally erodible cropland and put it into a perennial vegetation. In Oklahoma, Old World Bluestems were cheap seed, and they were promoted heavily by OSU and by USDA out of Woodward. Kansas allowed Old World Bluestems to be planted in CRP in the first couple of signups for CRP program. And then Kansas said, no, whoa, Nelly, we are not going to plant this. This is not a good idea. We need to stick with our native grasses for CRP. Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, and eastern New Mexico planted a large amount of Old World Bluestem to CRP. And subsequently, other people decided that they would just grow it for hay production. Because you're going to ask the question, why does it establish quickly? Sorry, I took that from you. But it basically, the seeds germinate quickly, establish readily. They grow really fast and establish a lot of forage. And you can fertilize them, and they produce a lot of biomass. You can also graze them heavily. All of that sounds like a good thing, right? Until it starts spreading into areas you didn't plant it, nor do you want it.
As you obviously know a lot about Old World Bluestems, for those people who had some qualities they really liked about this grass, when did they start to realize that they might actually be a problem?
I remember going to Woodward, Oklahoma, and giving so I got my PhD here at K-State. I did a plant ecology grazing system stocking rate study, and I actually talked about Old World Bluestem when I was working on my PhD in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. And in probably the early 2000s, I was invited to give a talk in Woodward, Oklahoma, and I said, okay, I'm going to do it. I basically had the people from OSU and from Woodward who had been promoting it, and I said it needs to be considered an invasive species. That was not necessarily received well. And then at that time, I was in the early 2000s, I was at Fort Hays State University on the faculty there. And the Comanche Pool Prairie Resource Foundation, that's based out of the southern part of Kansas, and Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, they really kind of were very interested in Old World Bluestem and its potential ecological effects. And I got funding to not necessarily study what was in my wheelhouse, which is plant ecology. I needed to convince people that it was a problem ecologically. And to do that, you have to show them that it impacts something that they love. And that was birds.
And what impact did you see as, I'm sure it's one of many ecological impacts?
Mm-hmm. So it reduces bird abundance, bird communities. Kind of just some of the species don't like to utilize it. It reduces arthropod biomass. So I know that sounds weird, but you got to think of insects as food for birds. And if you're removing or reducing the amount of those insects those birds have to eat, you're negatively influencing the birds as well. And so birds have been shown to be reduced by them. Native grasses and forbs can be outcompeted by them. Certainly arthropods are insects. And then we've seen some studies in Oklahoma and Texas that have shown some small mammals are reduced by them, swift foxes. And then there was recently, the most recent study that was on a particular species was scaled quail in Texas. And they were shown to be reduced by them. And basically I could also go below ground because the soil microbial community can also be affected by them.
How is the soil microbial community affected by them?
So all of our native warm season grasses rely on this fungus called mycorrhizal fungi, right? And the Old World Bluestems shift the types of mycorrhizal fungi that are there and the abundance of them. And that can be inhibiting, or that can inhibit the ability of native species to grow and establish.
What are some of those really long-term impacts of Old World Bluestem?
So long-term impacts, I'm just kind of a philosophical person when I think of this. And I think that we have such limited amount of our native tallgrass and mixed grass prairie left that we need to do everything in our power to try to protect it. And so for me, when I see Old World Bluestems invading our native grasslands, it just hurts my heart. And I think that we as natural resource managers, as ranchers, who really treasure all the services that those rangelands provide, not to mention the beauty of them, right? I think that Old World Bluestems are really going to inhibit that, and they definitely, so they'll create a whole monoculture. And so it's you're kind of looking like at a crop field instead of one of our beautiful tallgrass prairies.
That was Karen Hickman, director of Oklahoma State University's Environmental Science Program, and she was also the 2024 president of the Society for Range Management and was this year's annual Kling L Anderson lecturer here at Kansas State University. Before we cut to a break, I would like to let you know that Karen will be joining us after the break as we continue our conversation on Old World Bluestems. However, if you're reaching your destination and don't want to miss out on a little more information from Karen, you can always find the rest of today's show by going to agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today as we continue our conversation with the 24th Annual Kling L Anderson Lecturer at K-State, Karen Hickman from Oklahoma State University. Karen, as we continue our conversation, you mentioned that Old World Bluestem is easily established, and so how quickly does it go from being one little patch to taking over a field?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't know that anyone knows. I have a colleague that was in the western part of Oklahoma who kept saying, "Oh, Karen, I can control it. It's not a problem. It's no problem at all." And I call that, he was looking at a sleeper population, right? So it was a population of plants that were just sleeping along. You didn't notice them. They weren't intruding. They weren't growing. And then something happened, which in that instance was the drought of we had 2011 to 14 or 15 drought in that part of Oklahoma. After that drought, that must have been an ecological trigger that basically woke up the Old World Bluestem, and it's just is prevalent and everywhere. And so I think it's here some places, and I think it just depends on what the situation is, whether or not it's going to just take over quickly. All I know is that we need to battle it now in our areas that are our native areas. We'll never eradicate it. I can't imagine that we can, but at least maybe we can control and limit its impact on those native prairies that are just so absolutely beautiful.
How could someone control it?
Oh, gosh. Those are questions for people that are better weed scientists than I am. But I will say that I've had an opportunity to work with Keith Harmony out at Western Kansas and Hayes and some of our researchers down in Oklahoma. And we've looked at, Keith and I, Keith mainly, did a study where we looked at 9 different herbicides. Then we did different timings of herbicides. And then fire. And so you're going to see in some instances glyphosate's good, but you can't just spray it once. If you spray it once, you could really kind of promote it and make it happy or mad, whichever the case may be. And it could actually expand. It's really going to have to be an integrative management approach and just kind of being very persistent. We are seeing in our region that some hot summer fires are kind of hitting it and reducing it, so you can kind of knock it back, but it can come back a few years later. So it's very persistent. And so I think just herbicide, grazing, and fire are going to be the ways to control it.
So not a one-time,
It's
once
not a
year.
one and done. No.
What are some other things that you just see happening in our rangeland right now that you find interesting?
So I had not been up to Manhattan in many, many years. And as I was driving up 177 and then coming into the Flint Hills, I was struck by the eastern red cedar trees and their expansion from when I was working in the Flint Hills. And it kind of broke my heart because I had thought that was probably going to happen 20 years ago. And I like being right, but I hated being proven right in this instance.
If people are wanting to find out more information about Old World Bluestem or the different species of it, what's your recommendation?
Gosh, certainly extension. If in Kansas, I think probably your best resource is Keith Harmony. But NRCS, the technical providers, they probably are going to have some really good information as well. I know many of them, and I know they are not fans of Old World Bluestem either. And then certainly they can reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to them.
Karen, anything else you'd like to share with our farmers and ranchers?
Good job doing what you do. We really appreciate you.
Karen, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby.
That was this year's Kling L Anderson lecturer at K-State, Karen Hickman, who's director of Oklahoma State University's Environmental Science Program. I will link her contact information in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by Danielle Stock, who is a PhD student in K-State's Department of Animal Sciences and Industry, as we hear what she had to present on at Cattlemen's Day.
Well, hi, my name is Danielle Stock. I'm originally from Waukon, Iowa. I'm currently a PhD student with Dr. Nicholas Diaz, but today I'm excited to share with you some of my master's work with Dr. Megan Rolfe and the Animal Breeding and Genetics Group on the genetic influence of beef bull fertility traits. So currently within the Angus breed, because that's the breed that I looked at, if you look at their EPD profile, which is available to producers, they really only have 2 EPDs that I would consider fertility EPDs. One of those being a heifer pregnancy EPD, and then the other one is actually currently still in the research development stage, which is the functional longevity EPD. But they don't have one that's considered a maternal EPD for male fertility. They do have the scrotal circumference EPD. However, they actually consider that a production EPD because it only includes adjusted scrotal circumference and yearling weight within that EPD's model. Therefore, my project was looking at trying to determine the heritability estimates, the repeatabilities, and the genetic correlations of 6 different fertility traits in Angus bulls with the goal of trying to determine the genetic components that could potentially be used in developing a genetic evaluation for male fertility. For my study, we utilized several different types of data, but the data I'm going to show you today was all stud collection records. So we utilized 2 different bull studs with collections from 2004 to 2022 from approximately 1,900 Angus bulls. And so of those Angus bulls, approximately 1,800 had been collected at least twice at that bull stud facility. So that might have been he was collected on 2 days within the same week, or he might have been collected one time in 2020 and then a second time in 2021 that allowed us to calculate those repeatability estimates. And this came to a grand total of approximately 65,000 collection records that we utilized to accurately estimate these values. So for the 6 fertility traits that I analyzed, the first one was scrotal circumference, which is where we're measuring that scrotum by pushing the testes all the way down and then using a measuring tape to measure the circumference in centimeters. The second 2 traits were motility traits, which progressive motility, that's one where we were accounting for what percent between 0 to 100 of those sperm cells were accurately moving forward in a straight line. And the second one was motility score, with those sperm cells being measured as very good, fair, and poor motility. And then the last 3 were all morphology traits, which looked at primary abnormalities, secondary abnormalities, and then normal sperm cell shape. So primary abnormalities are ones that are thought to originate while that sperm cell is developing, and then secondary abnormalities are abnormalities that are thought to develop while that sperm is gaining its ability to move forward. So getting into the heritability estimates, these would be looking at what proportion of a phenotype's variation is coming from an animal's genetics. So we can see that scrotal circumference has a high heritability estimate. I know 0.05 might not seem high, but for genetics, that's a very high heritability estimate, whereas all of the motility and morphology traits are actually considered lowly heritable. Even though they are lowly heritable, though, we are still able to make genetic progress on them if we're selecting for them. Moving into the repeatability estimates, these would be looking at if we measured in one day and a month later, what proportion are going to be the same estimate. And here again, we see scrotal circumference is 93% repeatable, which I think makes sense to a lot of people. But really good was that our motility and our morphology traits also had moderate to highly repeatability. And then moving into those genetic correlations, which are the relationships between all of the traits, you will see that scrotal circumference was unfavorably related with all of our motility and morphology traits, which is actually different from what the literature says. So we are still currently looking into this relationship. So our key takeaways were that scrotal circumference is more highly heritable, so it's easier to select for that, but we can still select on those semen quality traits. And all of the traits were moderately to highly repeatable, with genetic correlations being unfavorable between scrotal circumference and semen quality traits, ultimately meaning that if we wanted to create a genetic evaluation for you as producers, we would probably utilize a fertility index, which would put all of those different traits into one model, and then we could accurately measure them out so that we were making sure that the weights of that EPD ultimately came out that you could select on one number that you could move your genetics forward for male fertility.
Once again, that was a K-State PhD student, Danielle Stock. You can see her presentations and other presentations from K-State's Cattlemen's Day by going to ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Time is running out for gardeners who want to successfully grow onions and potatoes in Kansas. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District, Cassie Thiessen, says the suggested planting date for potatoes is mid-March to early April, and for onions it's late March to early April. Cassie, if I remember right, you were going to do a little bit of gardening this past weekend, and as part of that, you were looking at your onions and also potatoes. So I guess maybe first off, how did that go for you, and then what kind of tips can we pass along to the listeners?
So potatoes and onions are probably my favorite thing to grow in the garden because they're my favorite things to eat. And they can be planted early springtime. They actually like the cool weather of spring, and then they're harvested fairly early as well, usually around early July or so.
When it comes to the onions, we're looking at seeds. Is that how that typically goes?
So you can plant them from seeds. You have to start them indoors that way in early January or February. I usually buy the little transplants at like a garden center and plant them that way. It's just a little bit easier, I think.
The planting process is fairly straightforward. They don't have to be dug deep, right?
Right. Yep. They go in pretty shallow. Onions have really shallow roots, so you have to kind of give them extra water, and they like a little bit extra fertilizer later in the season, but they're pretty easy to grow overall.
They are a little bit hard to get established, so we need to kind of make sure that we're keeping weeds under control.
Yep, that's usually the hard part in gardening, keeping those weeds under control, but just shallowly cultivating around them or putting some mulch down is helpful too.
And I think these are maybe like 1 inch apart, and you can do several rows?
It kind of depends on how big you want them to get. If you're looking for big, bulbed onions, I'd do more like 4 to 6 inches apart in the row. But if it's just a green onion, then yeah, you can do them pretty close together. When
it comes to watering, I know things have been so dry lately, I'm assuming that we're going to have to do some watering on our own?
Oh, yeah. You never know what's going to happen in summer in Kansas, but we usually have to plan on watering if we don't get rain. Most garden crops usually need about 1 inch of water per week.
I know there are a lot of varieties you can grow. What seemed to work the best in Kansas for you anyway?
Sure. There's lots of different types. I usually like a sweet type of onion, like a candy onion. The only bad thing about those is they don't last quite as long in storage after you harvest them. But for potatoes, there's lots of different types as well. It's usually kind of dependent on what you can find at the garden center, I think.
How long before you can actually start harvesting the onions then?
So you kind of want to look when you buy them. There's a number called days to maturity. And usually for onions, I think it's around 90 days or so, and for potatoes, 90 to 100 days. So you can kind of plan it on your calendar. I like to know, last weekend I planted them, so I'm going to need to look at 100 days from now, and that's about the time I'll be thinking about harvesting them.
Potatoes are also kind of a shallow planted crop as well.
Yep. So they actually grow from a stem piece, a piece of the cut seed potato. So you kind of have to hill them up, actually. You grab dirt from around the row and hill up the potato. That way you don't expose the potatoes to sunlight. All gardens really need about 6 to 8 hours of full sun for the best crops, especially fruiting crops like tomatoes, things like that need full sun.
And again, we're looking for something that's going to be well-drained, some loose soil as well?
Yep. Adding organic matter to your soil is really helpful, especially if you have like a heavy clay soil. A lot of times Kansas soil is kind of sticky and heavy, so adding in some organic matter is really helpful, especially for things that grow underground like potatoes and onions.
And anybody who's grown potatoes knows that they emerge slowly. It's a long process.
It is, yep. It's usually almost a month until you see those little sprouts pop up, but you just have to have some patience and know that they're doing the work underground.
What about crop rotation? Is there anything we should know there?
Yeah, so about every 3 to 4 years, you don't want to plant the same crop in that spot. So if you can rotate, that's best. If you have a small garden, you can do more strategies like picking disease-resistant varieties or more pest management. But if you are able to rotate, it's definitely recommended.
And I know with both of these, we want to make sure we're getting them in the ground. If they're not already in the ground, getting them in the ground relatively soon.
Yep, that's right. They like the cool weather, so they'll start growing and thriving this spring when it's still pretty cool before the heat of July and August set in.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District, Cassie Thiessen, with information on growing onions and potatoes. To learn more, contact your local extension office or check out the Kansas Garden Guide, available online and through the K-State Research and Extension bookstore. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.